Well, good morning, everyone, and let me add my welcome to Andrews. My name's Jono, if we haven't met before. It's lovely to see lots of you here this morning, and particularly a warm welcome back if this is your first Sunday here after the holidays, or even your first Sunday here altogether. You're really welcome here. And I don't know about you guys, but one thing that I like to do over the holidays is to watch TV. Maybe you guys have something like Netflix or Disney Plus or Amazon Prime, and often, this series on these streaming services will begin with a recap, won't they? So I remember when I watched Homeland, which maybe some of you have seen a few years ago, and every episode would begin with a previously on Homeland scene. And it will basically be a summary of what we saw in the last episode as you begin the next episode. And we're continuing this two-part series in these first 11 verses of Romans 5. And we're going to start with a bit of a recap, and particularly a recap of the question that we started with last week. So those of you who are here will remember that we were asking this question: what does the gospel do for a Christian? This message about Jesus that the Christian has heard and the Christian has responded to, what effect does it have and what result does it bring for them? And one thing we said is that it's easy to feel like the gospel actually does very little. So we said that Christians experience the same problems as the rest of the world, the family issues, the health issues, the career issues. And maybe you're here and you're not a Christian. You're really welcome here if that is you. And my guess is that you've experienced one, two, or all three of those things I just listed. But if you're here and you're a Christian, which is most of us, I guess, actually, I can be pretty sure that you've experienced one, two, or all three of those things as well. Because actually, Christians experience all the same problems as the rest of the world, don't they? The family issues, the health issues, the career issues. And actually, often Christians experience extra problems. Sometimes Christians face verbal opposition. So I can remember when I was a student at university, I was part of the Christian Union, and we had a week of events where we were introducing students at the university to Jesus and showing them why we thought he was really important. And I can remember one of my teachers at the university walked past. I was handing out some leaflets and flyers to the passing by students. And he stopped, we had a conversation, and I can remember him saying to me that I shouldn't be peddling this stuff about Jesus being the only way and the one way to God. And I don't think he was trying to be particularly unkind. We got on quite well. But there was this element of hostility in what he said. Maybe you've experienced something like that, or perhaps something much more strong in terms of verbal opposition to your Christian faith. And on top of that, Christians, even in lots of parts of the world, face physical opposition, don't they? So I went on the Open Doors website this week, where you can read about the way that Christians in different countries of the world are treated. And they have something on the website called the World Watch List. And it's basically a top 50 of the most severely persecuted countries for their Christian faith across the world. And I went on number 2, which was North Korea. And it was horrible to read about the kind of ways that Christians are treated. Forced labor camps, torture, even murder. And it's awful to read about the kind of physical opposition that Christians face all over the world. So Christians experience the same problems as the rest of the world, extra problems on top of that, the verbal opposition, the physical opposition. And so what does the gospel do for a Christian? Well, it might feel like the answer is that it doesn't do a lot. Well, one thing that we said last week is that this passage in Romans 5 is here to show us that that isn't true, that actually the gospel does do a lot. And we also said that the aim and the goal of this passage kind of has two elements to it. Firstly, that we see how much the gospel has done for us and appreciate all that the gospel has achieved and won for the Christian. But by extension, we also see how much the gospel could do for others, to give us a kind of outward focus and to be thinking, if my friend believed this down the road, if my neighbour believed this, if my work colleague believed this, if my school friend believed this, then all that the gospel has done for me, the gospel could do for them. And last week, you might remember that we saw that Paul achieved this aim by telling us that the gospel brings justification, leading to blessings now friendship with God, access to grace, joy in hope. They were the three present blessings we saw last week. Well, this week, Paul, the author of this letter, he achieves that aim by telling us this, something slightly different but similar as well. The gospel brings justification, leading to certain salvation later. And as with last week, we'll break that into two parts. So here's the first part. What does the gospel do for a Christian? Point one, the gospel brings justification. The Christian has been declared righteous by God in his divine courtroom. They've had his stamp of approval and his thumbs up because they've believed this message about Jesus. And if you were here last week, you'll also notice that this was the same first point that we had last week. And so why are we saying the same thing twice? Well, one reason is because Paul says the same thing twice. So if you look at verse 1, and I'll read that for us, Paul says, therefore, since we have been justified. And if you look down to verse 9, Paul says something very, very similar. Since, therefore, we have now been justified. So Paul says the same thing twice, and so perhaps it's fine for us to say the same thing twice. But actually, if we read on in both of those verses, we see that Paul doesn't say exactly the same thing twice. So in verse 1, therefore, since we have been justified by faith. And down in verse 9, since, therefore, we have now been justified by his blood. So there's these two components that Paul sort of brings out in relationship to justification, by faith and by his blood. And last week we focused on the by faith element. We thought about that component. And we said how we aren't justified by what we've done. The opposite of being justified by faith is being justified by works in this book of Romans. And we're not justified that way, Paul is adamant to say. And actually we couldn't be justified that way. Because we ignore God, because we break his rules, his laws, our hope of our works justifying us is a dead hope that won't work. We couldn't be justified that way. Instead, we are justified by what we believe, by faith, by our trust in God. And this week, we're sort of moving from, you might say, our part in justification to Jesus' part in justification. In a way, that's probably not a very helpful way of putting it, because the whole point is that we're not saved or justified by what we've done. But in one sense, I wonder if that's a helpful way of seeing the transition, moving from our faith to Jesus' blood. So that brings us to this week's component of justification, by his blood, through Jesus' death. And I guess the obvious question is, how does Jesus' death bring justification? Well, actually, from this passage, I think you can answer that question in one word: substitution. And that's just the idea of someone taking the place of another. So if we apply that to Jesus' death, it is the idea that Jesus died in our place, that Jesus died instead of us. And dying instead of another is a rare thing, isn't it? It's not something that we see every day. But there are some examples. So I was reading this book quite recently called Defending Substitution. It's a really good book and I recommend it. And in the book, the author talks about some examples of people dying for each other in the classical world, so in the world of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And he talks about this group of people called the Pythagoreans, who were basically the followers of Pythagoras, who you might remember from your maths classes, helped us with something about triangles that I've forgotten now. But anyway, this group called the Pythagoreans, the author talks about how they were willing to die for each other, and they were willing to lay down their lives for their friends and their fellow Pythagoreans. So there's one example from the classical world. There's also examples from the contemporary world. I actually had a little search this week and couldn't find that much, actually. But one example I did find was a guy called Tim McCarthy, who you might have heard of, who was a member of the Secret Service in the US and worked under Ronald Reagan, who was the US president at the time. And one day, Ronald Reagan was leaving his hotel, and he was coming towards his car, and then suddenly there was the sound of gunshots. So someone was trying to assassinate Ronald Reagan, and Tim McCarthy, this member of the Secret Service, he got in the way of the assassin and Ronald Reagan and took a bullet to his stomach. So that's an example, isn't it, of someone willing to die for another. Tim McCarthy willing to die for Ronald Reagan. Actually, he made a full recovery and he's still alive today. But the point stands, doesn't it, that there was a willingness there to get in the way and to take the death that Reagan would have faced. I wonder if we can also make it more personal, though. I wonder if there's people who you can think of and you think that you would be willing to die for them. I mean, if you could give an organ transplant that ended your life but saved another person's life, I wonder who you'd be willing to do that for. Maybe your sibling, maybe your spouse, maybe your child. So there are some examples, aren't there, of where people would be willing to die for another. But actually, they are rare, aren't they? Dying instead of another is a rare thing. And actually, if we think about all of those examples, the thing that unites them, or what they have in common, is that the person who's willing to die deems the other person a worthy recipient, someone who deserves them dying for them. So the friend who the Pythagorean loves, or the president that Tim McCarthy serves, or the family member that you cherish. Dying instead of a worthy person is rare. Dying instead of someone unworthy is even rarer, isn't it? I mean, if you think about that organ transplant that you could give, that ends your life and saves another person's life, you wouldn't do it for someone who robbed your house. You wouldn't do it for someone who attacked you on the streets. It's just not the sort of way we're wired, really, is it? We wouldn't do that. But that is like what Jesus does for us, and we've been thinking about it in the service so far. Let me read to you from verse 6. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You see, Jesus goes even further than dying for the worthy, doesn't he? In verse 7, Paul talks about how one might die for a righteous person. You know, maybe you die for someone who's good, like we were saying with those other examples. You know, maybe you die for the friend or the president or the family member, the righteous and the good. But Jesus goes further than that, doesn't he? He doesn't die for the unworthy. He doesn't die for the worthy. He dies for the unworthy. Maybe you notice the ways that we were described in those verses. While we were still weak, Christ died for the ungodly. Or verse 8, while we were still sinners. Jesus died for people who ignored God and broke his law, and actually people who deserved to die. And he took their death instead of them. Jesus dies for the unworthy. We couldn't be justified by what we've done because we ignore God, because we break his law, because we're unworthy. But we can be justified by what Jesus did. He died in our place. He died instead of us as those who were weak, ungodly, sinners, deserving of death. Let me read you the first half of verse 9 again. Since, therefore, we have now been justified by his blood. And as we said last week, that is a wonderful thing, isn't it? That we can be justified and we can get God's stamp of approval and his thumbs up. And you might remember last week we thought about the difference that makes to our present, the blessings that we have now. And this week we're going to think more about the difference that makes to our future and the salvation that we have later. So that brings us to our second point, which you can see on your service sheets as well. What does the gospel do for a Christian? Point 1, the gospel brings justification. Point 2, leading to certain salvation later. And last week we thought a little bit about this already. We thought about what we're saved to. And we thought about how we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. This idea of having transformed bodies, we said. Bodies that are no longer bodies of death, that decay and deteriorate. And bodies that are no longer bodies of sin, where we find ourselves doing things that we don't want to do. Actually, the Christian hope is that that will not be the case one day. One day we'll have transformed bodies. That's what we're saved to, the glory of God. And what we're saved from, that's what we're going to add this week. So at the end of verse 9, you might have noticed that it speaks about being saved from the wrath of God. Paul's already in Romans spoken about this day of God's anger, his righteous wrath against evil and sin, where sin will be punished, where evil will be punished. And Paul says that we can be saved from that. We can be saved from the wrath of God. So that's the kind of nature of this salvation. And particularly what Paul wants us to see is that we can have assurance and certainty of that salvation to the glory of God from the wrath of God. And we're just going to see two quick reasons why we can have certainty and assurance of this salvation. First one, because of God's love displayed. In verse 8, you might remember we saw that God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God loved us enough to give his own son to die in our place. And verses 9 and verse 10 sort of restate that past event, but also give the future implication of that. So each sentence is in two halves. One looks back to the past, one looks forward to the future. So let me read to you from verse 9. Since, therefore, we have now been justified by his blood. So that's the past event. That's the death of Jesus on our behalf. And here's the future implication. Much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. So if God has loved us enough to justify us before him, then he loves us enough to save us in the future. Well, the same thing, or similar thing at least in verse 10, in slightly different language. For if, while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his son, again, that's looking back to that past event, much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. There's that future implication again. If God loves us enough to reconcile us to him, make us his friends, he loves us enough to save us in the future. Andrew's already mentioned that we've had a couple of engagements at Grace Church over the last couple of weeks, which is always really exciting. And often in an engagement, which Andrew also mentioned, the man will give the woman a ring. And it's often a precious and a costly ring. And the way I understand it, at least traditionally perhaps, the ring signifies to the woman that the man loves her enough to give her this ring and to assure her of the marriage that will come in the future. And I guess that's a little bit like what we're seeing in verses 9 and 10, isn't it? You know, if the man loves the woman enough to give her this precious ring, he loves her enough to marry her in the future. And in the same way, if God loved us enough to give his precious and own son to die in our place, then he loves us enough to save us in the future. That's the first reason we can have certainty of this salvation, because of God's love displayed. Here's the second reason, because of God's love experienced. So we're going to look back to before verses 6 to 8 now, verse 5. So let me read to you verse 5. Hope does not put us to shame. In other words, this hope that we have of a future salvation from the wrath of God to the glory of God, that isn't a hope that will disappoint us or be a hope in vain. It is a certainty in the future. Why is it a certainty? Well, let me read on. Because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So God's love, it isn't just a reality out there, displayed in history at the cross as Jesus dies for us. It's also a reality in here, isn't it, in verse 5? God's love has been poured into our hearts. I can remember when I was a teenager going to a Christian conference, and I remember the preacher at this conference was talking about the kind of thing we've been saying today, speaking about how God loves us, and he's shown his love by sending his son to die in our place. And I can remember at that moment it just really coming home to me, and it just clicked that God loved me, and it really went into my heart, and I just felt it and experienced it as a real thing. And if you're a Christian, I guess you've had moments a bit like that, where you know God's love in here. And in those moments, we should remember the beginning of verse 5. Hope does not put us to shame. If God loved us enough to give his own son, which we experience in here, then he loves us enough to save us in the future. we can have assurance, we can have certainty of this salvation because of God's love. His love displayed out there at the cross 2,000 years ago. His love experienced in here through the Holy Spirit who has been given to the Christian. And I've just been thinking a bit about that this week. I'm really enjoying how, as Christians, we have a certainty in a world of so many uncertainties. I mean, if you take those three things we thought about right at the start, a family, we ask questions, don't we, like, will my children be happy at school? Or in terms of our health, will my operation next week be successful? Or in terms of our career, will I still have my job in a week? Not in a week, in a year, sorry. That's a very uncertain job if you're going to lose it in a week. But if we're honest, with all of those questions, we don't know the answer, do we? We can hope for particular answers, but we do not know for sure what the answer is. But wonderfully, the Christian can for sure answer this question with yes. Will I be saved from the wrath of God to the glory of God? Well, we do know the answer to that question. Yes, as the Christian, you will. And that is a wonderful thing, isn't it? In a world of uncertainties, having that sure certainty. The gospel brings justification, leading to certain salvation later. We started with the question, didn't we, over both of these 2 weeks. What does the gospel do for a Christian? And we said it's easy to feel like the gospel doesn't do a lot. Christians experience the same problems as the rest of the world, the family issues, the health issues, the career issues. And actually, Christians often experience extra problems. The verbal opposition, the physical opposition, like those Christians in North Korea. But Paul wants us to see that actually the gospel does do a lot. The gospel brings justification, leading to certain and sure salvation later. And as we said, that aim, that goal, it has two elements for us. That we see how much the gospel has done for us. The blessings we have now, the friendship with God, the access to grace, the joy and hope, and the salvation we have later, the certain and sure salvation we have later. And as we see how much the gospel has done for us, in turn we see how much the gospel could do for others. If my school friend believed this, if my work colleague believed this, if my neighbour down the road believed this, all the gospel's done for me, the gospel could do for them. Well, we're going to take a moment of pause there to think about those verses and what we've seen from them, and then we'll be led in prayer.